Today, Imperial Valley is home to some of the most productive land in the world, where farmers grow 80% of America's winter vegetables and enough lettuce to serve a salad to 1/3 of the world's population. Yet, in 1900, the Imperial Valley was an empty, dry desert. Before the water came, Imperial Valley was known as the Devil's Pass. 49ers on their way to the gold rush took their chances through the barren terrain. Many left their possessions on the trail when the water ran out between wells. They and their animals sometimes died of thirst. But a few visionaries saw that the Colorado River could be diverted into the desert and onto fertile land to grow food for millions. Starting 1,400 miles north in Wyoming and Colorado, the river had carved out the Grand Canyon, carrying with it millions of tons of silt, or fine dirt. As the river meandered, it left that dirt in what would be known as the Imperial Valley, depositing earth from the Grand Canyon, layer upon layer. Wherever the river touched the rich earth, dense plant growth sprang to life. In 1849, one prospector, a doctor named Oliver Wazcraft, saw that this dry, empty desert had once been filled with a massive lake. Wazcraft envisioned that the swirling waters of the Colorado River could be returned to their ancient home to transform this desert into a garden oasis. For 38 years, Wazcraft worked tirelessly to get the government's permission to bring water to the desert. But the Civil War and its aftermath demanded Congress's attention. Wazcraft and his dream both withered away. He died broke in 1887. Just as Wazcraft was beginning his quest, a geologist named William Blake joined an expedition to survey the West for a possible railroad route. Blake confirmed that the wandering Colorado River had spilled over into the desert and formed a mammoth lake that he named Lake Cahuilla for the native people he met there. Blake's report helped bring the railroad from Los Angeles to Yuma in 1877, and the quest to bring water to the desert began again in 1893 when Charles Rockwood, an engineer and surveyor from Michigan, took up the cause. He met William T Heffernan, an Army doctor in Yuma, Arizona, who invested money to keep the project alive. In that time, to get the right to take water from a river, you simply had to post your claim at the spot on the riverbank where you would divert the water, stating how much water you would use. Heffernan himself posted the claim and took trains to Los Angeles and San Diego to record it at the courthouse. You then had 60 days to prove your claim, that is, actually use the water, or the claim expired. So while Rockwood tried to raise money for the project, Heffernan and others went back to that riverbank over and over again. The Imperial Valley's rights to the most water on the Colorado River started with those postings on the riverbank. But channeling the river water back into the desert would not be easy. They would need lots of money. Rockwood met a businessman from Chicago named Anthony Heber. Together, Rockwood, Heffernan, and Heber formed the California Development Company in New Jersey in 1896. They needed about $40 million in today's money to build a canal across the river's delta and the desert to Imperial Valley farmland. Because high sand dunes blocked the route in California, Rockwood planned to channel water into Mexico for 42 miles and then back into the Imperial Valley near Calexico, California, a total distance of 60 miles. But who would invest their money in such a scheme? To carry water many miles through a foreign country into a dry desert, hot as a furnace. Rockwood took trains to Chicago, New York, and Mexico City trying to raise money. And he took steamships to London and Scotland 3 times with no luck. The worldwide financial panic of 1893 The deaths of potential investors and the War of 1898 ruined their hopes again and again. Oliver Wazcraft had failed. Charles Rockwood and Anthony Heber were about to give up. And then came George Chaffee. Chaffee was a self-taught engineer from Ontario, Canada. When he was just 14 years old, he captained a ship across Lake Michigan in a blizzard. In 1880, at age 32, he followed his parents west to Riverside. He proved himself as a land developer and master of irrigation by building the communities of Etiwanda and Ontario, California. He built the first hydroelectric plant west of the Mississippi and became wealthy and respected. When Chaffee first heard about irrigating Imperial Valley, he thought the desert would be too hot for people to work in. But after bringing water to the blistering deserts of Australia, he decided to take on the Imperial Valley project. With a Native American guide, Chaffee spent 3 weeks walking the route the water would take through Mexico. Satisfied that the idea would work, Chaffee signed a contract in April of 1900 to take over Rockwood and Heber's California Development Company. Based on his reputation alone, Chaffee found funding, bought a dredger, and cut a canal from the Colorado River into a natural overflow channel known as the Alamo River. With these few resources and a little dynamite, the Imperial Valley was born. What Rockwood couldn't do in 7 years, Chaffee accomplished in a few months. Water came to the Imperial Valley in June of 1901, and Chaffee did it for $100,000. He built a temporary wooden control gate, and the water began to flow. Farmers grew crops where no crops had ever been grown before. And townsfolk came too, merchants, bankers, teachers, newspapermen, and mule-drawn wagons with supplies. The California Development Company was in full swing from its headquarters in Calexico. Imperial Valley made news across the nation, and George Chaffee held a tour for reporters to see how the desert was blooming. Chaffee, along with the thousands of settlers, had accomplished so much, but Rockwood resented Chaffee's control over his dream and wanted his company back. Chaffee didn't protect his shares in the California Development Company. Rockwood made allies and took the company over again. He invited Heber back. Chaffee was out. Farmers kept clearing land and building canals, but as good as times were, things soon went wrong. Out of all the rivers in the world, the Colorado was one of the wildest. It would rage flush and full, spring through late summer. Then when Wyoming and Colorado froze, there would be little flow during the late fall and winter. Farmers were terrified. Crops were dying. Their livelihood, even their lives, depended on water. Because Chaffee's gate was set above the river's winter level, Rockwood cut a ditch from the river into the intake canal, first in the United States and the second year in Mexico. Then in the spring, just before the snowmelt floods came, the cut would be filled in and the water would again come through Chaffee's gate. That worked for 2 winters. Then everything went terribly wrong for the California Development Company, and Charlie Rockwood ran into another spell of very bad luck. In the fall of 1904, Rockwood cut another ditch, thinking that like before, he could close the cut with an earthen dam before the high water of spring snowmelt. Rockwood didn't count on Mother Nature having a temper tantrum. In the spring of 1905, torrential rains in Arizona swelled the river to many times its normal flow. The river overflowed its bed into Rockwood's small ditch, pushing its way downhill to the west and widening the gap like a hungry, earth-devouring giant. The Colorado River had abandoned its normal course and poured into the Imperial Valley, as it had done many times in ages past. Attempting to fill the widening breach, the California Development Company drove piles through bundles of arrowweed or cachinilla woven by hundreds of Pima, Papago, Kukapa, Maricopa, and Yuma Indians, followed by 10,000 sandbags. But the currents just carried them away. Some settlers lost their homes or found themselves surrounded by water. Others watched as their houses just crumbled into the New River flood channel. Rockwood tried again in June, but by then the river was running at 8 times its average flow, and the engineers and Native American workers were no match for this insistent force of nature. Their makeshift dam was swept away. As spring turned into summer, the California Development Company had to give up. They had barely enough money to keep the water flowing to the farmers, so Edward Harriman, owner of the Southern Pacific Railroad, invested $200,000 to make the repairs. Engineers came from all over the world to marvel at this gargantuan engineering disaster. In 1901, what we call the Salton Sea was empty. It was last filled in the 1700s. When water for agriculture first arrived, there was actually a business harvesting salt from the empty Salton sink. As the water rushed into the lowest part of the valley, it recreated the ancient Lake Cahuilla, now called the Salton Sea. The largest inland sea in California, a massive lake 36 miles long and 16 miles wide. Even today, the New River Gorge from Mexicali to the Salton Sea is, in places, a half-mile wide and 40 feet deep. The Southern Pacific Railroad had to move many miles of railroad tracks 3 times to higher ground. Try to imagine that whole New River channel full of water. Imagine if you were the one responsible, as Charles Rockwood was, for making the cut in the riverbank that resulted in this disaster. The Rampaging River was cutting backward from north to south, on some days 1,000 feet. People were genuinely afraid that the backward cutting would continue all the way back 60 miles to the river's normal channel. If that happened, then the whole Imperial Valley would be lost. There would be no way to irrigate the land by gravity anymore. For nearly 2 years, the entire Colorado River flowed into the Imperial Valley. The onrushing water undermined much of Calexico and Mexicali. It destroyed 14,000 acres of farmland and isolated the west side of the valley. Now began more attempts to put the river back into its bed, each attempt on a larger scale. Charles Rockwood designed a wooden headgate that was built to take the whole flow of the river, but when the river was turned into it, it floated away. At this point, even the resources of the Southern Pacific Railroad were exhausted. They had spent millions of dollars to preserve a growing agricultural industry and protect their shipping interests. E. H. Harriman, the owner of the railroad, appealed to President Roosevelt and the federal government for help. Roosevelt replied,
"I assume you will resume work immediately to close the break in the Colorado River."
Roosevelt then asked Congress to intervene to secure the lands of the people of Imperial Valley. Again, the full resources of the railroad were brought into play. A famous professor of engineering, Harry Thomas Corey, was given charge of the project. Thousands of men were employed to dam the river back into its channel. Rock was brought from quarries up to 300 miles distant. The business of the Southern Pacific Railroad stopped to make way for the repair. For 3 weeks, rail cars dumped rock day and night, non-stop into the river. Even today, motorists from Interstate 8 north of Pilot Knob can see where the hillside was quarried away. That rock went to stop the wild Colorado River during the winter of 1907. And finally, on February 7th, the Colorado River was diverted back into its channel for good. The flows in the new river quickly dropped. Only water destined for farmland flowed into the Imperial Valley, guided by gates and canals. Corey had completed his task. Soon business began to pick up. Land values rose. and the paralyzing anxiety that had lain over the settlers of the valley began to lift. Everyone could breathe again. After the break in the river was finally closed, the California Development Company declared bankruptcy. The Southern Pacific Railroad took over its water delivery system. Chaffee had long ago left the Imperial Valley. Heber had moved on. He died in a hotel fire in 1906. Corey stayed on for 2 more years, supervising the irrigation system and building levees in Mexico. Rockwood, the one who had dreamed of the largest irrigation project in the world, left in 1905, but kept the valley in his heart. He returned some years later, again as engineer of the water system. The Imperial Valley needed one more David to tame the Goliath that was the river. John Morton Eshelman, a bright young attorney, came to El Centro for tuberculosis in 1905. He stayed in the valley long enough to form the Imperial Irrigation District in 1911, which took over the water system from the railroad. The Colorado was still a wild river. It wouldn't be until El Centro Congressman Philip David Swing pushed through the Boulder Canyon Act in 1928 and the completion of Hoover Dam in 1935 that the worry of flooding would cease. Until Hoover Dam controlled the river, the Imperial Irrigation District maintained 75 miles of levees in the Mexicali Valley. There were more high water floods, but levees contained the rushing waters in Mexico. The Imperial Valley still received its water from the Alamo Canal through Mexico until 1942, when the All-American Canal was completed. The IID finally had full control of the water from Imperial Dam north of Yuma to the farms of Imperial Valley. Times have changed since 1911. Back then, the IID directors had to donate $150 of their own money each for operating expenses. Today, the IID still supplies water to the valley and electrical power too. It has an annual budget of $900 million. The IID provides water to nearly 500,000 acres of farmland, some of the most productive, efficient land in the world. Through the vision and work of Wazcraft, Rockwood, Heffernan, Heber, Chaffee, Corey, and thousands of others, today the Imperial Valley can grow food and fiber for the nation and the world.
I wonder how the old folks are at home. I wonder if they miss me when I'm gone. I wonder if they pray for the boy who went away and left their dear old parents all alone. You could hear the cattle lowing in the lane. You could almost see the fields of bluegrass green. You could almost hear them cry as they kissed their boy goodbye. I wonder how the old folks are at home.